Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the keynote session. And then following this, don't forget, we have one more series of sessions and then back in this room for a wrap-up. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch and the morning sessions. Again, many thanks to the City of Abbotsford and Sue Fetterspiel for providing all the food for well over 100 hungry participants. So great, thank you. And I would like to introduce to you now Dr. Gary Fair. He's the Associate Vice President of Research and Community and Engagement. So Gary's amazing. I just have to say a word about being the director of a research center in a smaller university that doesn't have a lot of big graduate programs. It can be hard to get research off the ground. It can be hard to get events like this off the ground. And I can't honestly say enough for the support that we've got from Gary and the research office. I think we've turned a corner at UFE in terms of the way research and research centers are supported. And research is such a critical piece of the education of our students. So you saw all the young people out there in the lime green hoodies. They're typically all engaged in some research project through their undergrad. And often they come to the centers like CERA, and like that group of them are working with different members of CERA. So we get a lot. Research is just such a big piece of doing the best job we can at educating them. So I really want to thank Gary, and I want to thank everyone that works in his office while he's here for me to do it. So thank you, Gary. And now I'm going to turn it over to Gary because he's going to introduce Dr. Keith Carlson for our keynote this afternoon.
Well, thank you, Shelley. And it's a lot of fun with this position that I have when I get to work with Shelley and others like Shelley. I mean, the things that are happening at the UFE because of our researchers, it's very gratifying. It's why I stay in the job I have. So thank you very much. Normally when I do an introduction for a keynote, we often focus primarily on the academic outputs that our speakers have compiled over the course of their career. And I will do that, but I also know Dr. Carlson beyond just an academic. And I want to say that I'm a fan. I'm a fan of his dedication, of his care for people, of the way he builds relationships, and the way he's dedicated to getting what he learns out to the community in ways that can be applied. Maybe I'll get this wrong, Keith, but I think you did 46 community engagement activities last year, or maybe that was just halfway through the year, I'm not sure. But you spoke, it was more than 46, and these are not requirements for him. These are almost like volunteer, like speaking to community groups, to schools, to different organizations, to tell them about our history and the way we're engaging with one another. I mean, this is because he does it out of his passion for what he studies and the people that he meets. So that's on a personal note. Academically, Professor Keith Thor Carlson holds the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous and Community Engaged History at the University of the Fraser Valley, where he has also been appointed Director of the Peace and Reconciliation Center. He's been partnering with the Stalo communities, helping to document and interpret history and cultural traditions since 1992. His research is designed and executed collaboratively with Indigenous communities so as to best meet community-identified priorities. Individually and/or with partners, Dr. Carlson has authored or edited 12 books and over 50 articles, including a Stalo Coast Salish History Atlas, 2001, and The Power of Place, The Problem of Time, Aboriginal Identity and Historical Consciousness in the Cauldron of Colonialism, from 2010. I want to say that it took me a long time to find a copy of that historical atlas and finally found one in a bookstore in Florida. He is currently working closely with the Stalo Research and Resource Management Center, investigating the history of children who did not return from residential schools, and with the Matsqui and Seabird Island communities in the development of curriculum resources. Please, with me, welcome Dr. Carlson.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Gary, for that introduction, and thank you, Shelley, for inviting me to be here today. It's a real pleasure. I'm happy to be here. I wish I could be here with you all day, to be honest, but there's an event that I'm co-hosting on the other campus at the same time, and so I was over there first thing this morning. I'm here, then I have to get back there again in a little bit, but this is really fascinating. I'm familiar with the topics and things today. I've been looking at the agenda, and I will follow up with some of the presenters because there's things I just would love to learn more about, and I'm sorry I can't be necessarily in the panel itself. Today, what I'll be talking about, so I don't know, about 6 months ago or something, Shelley and I were just chatting with each other about what we do, what our research is, and the kind of work that the way she brings her research into her coursework for her students, and I was doing the same. And we talked a little bit about elders, Indigenous elders, Stalo elders, and other Coast Salish elders, and that these are the people that I work most closely with over the past 35 years, and I've worked with some who have very, very clear minds from the perspective of sort of what a clinician might say, and others who have had what would be what people refer to as dementia today. But it was interesting that that isn't necessarily how those people themselves understand themselves at that time in their life, or the way their families necessarily interpret that. And so I told Shelley I would try to pull something together that looked at the different ways that people understand getting old and the associations with dementia and what that sort of means in terms of ageism across cultures. So I'm going to start with just a little anecdotal piece that I use in several of my talks, because I want you to get a real practical example of something that I think is just a key concept that we need to understand. And this is the idea that meaning precedes experience. And it was one of these concepts I remember as a student learning this, and suddenly it was like a light went on. I suddenly was able to see things a little bit differently in the world in ways that I couldn't before. And so I'm going to give you just a simple example, and then we'll use this as just a way to enter some other information that I'll be sharing with you today. So meaning precedes experience. Now, we might think that if we have a shared experience, we give it the same meaning. We have the same meaning. But I think even when it comes to very basic little things, it's actually not the case. And so misunderstandings are common in our society, especially when it comes to across cultures, genders, and things like that. So imagine I'm teaching my course here on campus in the evening, and my course wraps up at 9:30. It's dark at 9:30 now. So you're my students, and I say, thank you very much. Make sure you do your homework for next week. I'll see you in a week. And off I go, and I walk out across the parking lot in the dark. I get into my car, and then I drive home. And nothing happened to me, nothing at all. I just walked across the parking lot, got into my car, and drove home. So I had the experience of doing that. And then let's just imagine that a minute or two later, a young female student from my class follows me out, and she steps exactly where I stepped, walks across that parking lot, gets into her car, and she drives home. Nothing happened to her either. So now we've had the exact same experience, the exact same experience. But did she bring a different meaning to that experience? Was she walking to the car with her keys between her knuckles in case she needed to defend herself? Was she speaking on her cell phone to a family member or friend so that if something happened, she'd be able to quickly communicate where she was and get assistance? Was she concerned, in other words, that she might be assaulted as she walked across that parking lot to get into her car and drive home? She brought a different meaning to what it means to walk across a parking lot at night and get into a car. And now imagine, just a minute or two after her, a young male student from my class walks out and puts their feet in the exact same place that the female student did, walks out to the parking lot, gets into their car, and leaves. But that male is either Indigenous or South Asian. They're a young male person of color. Now, They're walking out to the car. They've had the same experience. Nothing has happened to them that I've had, the same experience that the young female student has had. But what meaning did they bring to that experience? Were they concerned that they'd be assaulted? Probably not. So in that sense, it's like me. I wasn't concerned that I would be assaulted. Were they concerned about anything else? Well, were they concerned that they might be there and be accused of being there to commit an assault or to commit a crime and be harassed by security or the police, even though they're just coming away from my lecture and my course? And so does that shape the clothes that they wear? Was it less likely they'd wear a hoodie with the hood up so they don't look like a tough street person, so they're not going to intimidate or frighten people or give that message? So they're dressing differently, walking differently perhaps, because of the meaning that they bring. So all three of us have had identical experiences, but all three of us have brought different meaning. And if we amplify that, if that's a difference, that little thing of walking across a parking lot, imagine the bigger things in our life and the meanings that we bring to our experiences. It not only shapes the way we behave in those experiences themselves, that is to say that the woman being afraid she might be assaulted, the man being afraid he might be accused of something, the way he maybe dresses or carries himself so he doesn't look as intimidating, and myself being oblivious to that as a white, middle-class white man. But it also might mean that female students are less likely to take courses in the evening, and male students who are people of color might be less likely to take those courses. And that means they have less likely opportunities or different opportunities to meet people, to meet a future partner, to meet someone who could become a business partner with them, or a love interest, or just someone who has an interest with theirs who could help them with their homework and they might become friends on campus. That might translate into also not going to the bank as often as somebody who's a white male person to ask for that loan, to be intimidated. And you can see how these things just amplify. It's what we think of as cumulative effects of someone's privilege, a privilege that I have that someone else maybe doesn't have. So that's meaning preceding experience. I think dementia is an experience. Old age is an experience. Senility is an experience. Those are terms that we've used that have meaning attached to them. The experience of being confused, of forgetting, whatever those are going to be. I'm going to walk through those with you. So that's the main point I want to make, just to get us set, and we'll pull back to this at the end. Now, I need to put my glasses on to be able to read my notes, and then the glasses, I can't see you, so it's... you know what I'm talking about. Now, in the 19th century, senility was regarded as a form of insanity in the West, in Britain, France, Germany, the United States. And senility or insanity could happen at any age. It was considered a product of either mental exhaustion or of shock. So older people tended to show up more often because they were more exhausted. But it wasn't something that was restricted to or characterized by age necessarily. In the mid-19th century, senility becomes separated, increasingly separated, though, from other forms of what they referred to as insanity or senility. And by the 20th century, it was recognized in the United Kingdom, and then soon after in America, as only one form of senility. That is to say that senile senility, aged senility, was different from other stigmatized types of what was still regarded as insanity at that time. Senility was indeed once a synonym for old age in Britain and Europe that referred to the inevitable weakness and decrepitude that old people faced in their future if they lived long enough. This changed in the West as a result of the gradual shift in Western medicine that allowed for the classification of symptoms, behaviors, and old age itself to be controlled, to be thought of, categorized in various ways. Whoops, excuse me. And so when Alois Alzheimer's described the clinical condition that now bears his name in 1907, dementia at that time was starting to become closely associated with old age and considered a normal and expected part of the aging process. And he sought to separate what he regarded as normal senile dementia from what we refer to as pathological softening of the brain. And he thought that it was impossible at that time, but that's what he was trying to do. Most American medical schools up until the 1930s taught that aging was a chronic disease. In the period between the two wars, First and Second World War, there emerged two competing schools, one that considered senility a pathological disorder, and the other that described it as a normal psychological state associated with aging, and it remained a major problem for science as opposed to theologians or philosophers to determine which was correct. So these are just some of the terms that were being thrown around, either as people saying these are synonyms, they mean the same thing, or to say, no, these are separate because now we've categorized, we've controlled these. And I should say, too, all of these have gendered components to them. So if anybody here has ever accused you of being a lunatic or acting with lunacy, that is actually an old reference to men who behave like women when they're on their menstrual cycles, when the moon, right? So when a woman is insane with natural insanity from menstrual cycles, if a man behaves like that, he is a lunatic. That's where those terms come from. If a man is acting hysterical, right? When you have a hysterectomy, if you're a woman, right? You're acting like a woman if a man does those things. So these senility, insanity, and dementia were strongly gendered. And as men had dementia, they were seen as being feminized in some ways. But also, and this is key to my talk today, being feminized, but also being turned into something of another culture, savagery, barbarism in some way. They were declining on a scale of civilization. Now, in the post-war years, we see a shift sort of from the discussions of what is senility and defining senility to what is senile dementia, right? A type of dementia that is characterized by old age, to things like Alzheimer's disease, biomedical descriptions of a measurable, scientifically measurable process in the brain. So as that was happening, as things were shifting more and more into this sort of strict sort of Western medical model, at the same time, there was a growing concern about what is the self to someone losing who they are as they go through dementia or senility or Alzheimer's disease. And that meant that in that time period, philosophers, theologians, and others who for a while had been being sort of pushed out of this conversation, a conversation they used to dominate in the 18th and early 19th century, now were being pulled back into those discussions. Michel Foucault, for example, and others have encouraged us to regard memory, consciousness, and the modern task of self-making as being essential to a definition of being fully alive. That's what it is to be fully alive. And they also challenge people to think of diagnosis and treatments of mental illness, of all kinds of mental illness, as products of power relationships. Relationships which at their core were concerned with categorizing and controlling a person through the process of othering someone through their definition of their disease, defining them by their disease, and then the boundary maintenance that goes into that. I'm not saying they were promoting that. What they were doing was saying, isn't it interesting? This is what we're seeing in society. This is the dark side of what was supposedly sort of the scientific enlightenment mode of coming to a better understanding of mental illness. At that same time, there were people in what's now referred to as the communication theory, schools of communication theory, who are trying to understand the difference between an oral society and a literate society. And so literate and oral, but by oral we don't mean illiterate, we mean non-literate, societies that haven't become literate. Now, this was regarded as the change, as you can see here. People like Walter Ong were at the center of this. There were others, John Goody and others. But what they said is if you look at individual people in Western society, you have little children who are oral, right? And little children are self-centered. They're unconcerned with other people. They don't hold complex concepts in their mind. They don't philosophize, right? But then as they age and mature, they take on the ability to read, and through reading, they become adults. And so the European idea of teenagerhood, which didn't really exist prior to the 18th century, you just were a child and an adult. The idea of teenagerhood, really that's an American 20th century kind of idea, but it's the idea that there's this middle age in the middle where you're neither child nor adult, and you're going and you're becoming something else. So for Ong and Goody, as people transitioned, they were becoming better, and it was seen as a one-way process. You went from oral to literate as a child, and you could never go back, and your mind was expanded by the process of being able to read. And they thought that this therefore applied also to societies, that there were oral societies that were also, in their minds, their interpretation, like child societies, societies of children who did not hold complex ideas, that did not have systems of government that were complex the way we would recognize them in the West, that didn't have complicated science the way we would recognize it in the West, that didn't have theology the way we would recognize it in the West. And so it was a way to categorize oral people as primitive people who didn't need to evolve into a civilized state in the same way that a child needed to evolve into a civilized adult in a literate world. Beyond those sorts of things, literacy was regarded as giving people the ability to preserve knowledge in a way that oral societies could not. So if you're as old as me, and I think most people in the room look like you're kind of in that kind of space, you remember when there was the encyclopedia at home. That was a big deal when your family bought an encyclopedia, and now you had access to the world's knowledge. Of course, now we have the internet and things, but that meant you could find answers to things that your mom and dad didn't know, that your grandmother and grandfather didn't know. It was giving you access way beyond what someone in an oral society, ostensibly, was able to access only through their familiar networks. Literacy was also regarded under these theories. I'm not saying this is true. I'm telling you this is what people were thinking at the time and interpreting. That literacy was a way to standardize the understanding of something. So this is where we get to sort of define something, and then we argue over that definition, and we refine it, and we come up with a more precise definition. So literacy enables that. And I can write down senility equals X, put it on a card, mail it off, and then Shelley picks it up at her home in Australia, and she starts to think, oh, Keith was saying this. I'm going to disagree. I'm going to think it's this. So we don't have to be physically present with each other. These ideas can somehow transmit themselves across space so that people can engage with ideas across space. And literacy enabled people to separate, therefore, an idea from the person who spoke it, and therefore engage in these abstract ideas. This is what the literary theorists were saying. Now, as I said just a minute ago, this creates this idea of hierarchical civilizations and cultures, that certain people are at the top because they're literate and they know how to use literacy really well. They use it to organize their military, their government, their libraries, their science, their universities, and that places them at the top of the scale. And then beneath those are people who are only semi-literate or partially literate in the way we do and don't use their literacy, if they do have it, in the same way that we do. So this reinforces very clearly in the Western mind in the 18th, 19th, and through up to the middle of the 20th century. This was taught in French schools up until the 1980s, for example. It was taught in British Columbia schools up until the Second World War, right? So this isn't ancient history. This is sadly much more recent. But it creates this idea that Indigenous people, by being Indigenous, the things that differentiate them culturally, makes them somehow inferior. It's a way of pushing people down in that regard. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the particulars in this area for cultures and things, but I want to start by saying that it's important to recognize that for Indigenous people in Canada, one in 10 people over the age of 65 in Canada are diagnosed with dementia of one kind or another, and 1 in 3 over the age of 85 are diagnosed with dementia of one kind over another. But Indigenous communities are 34% higher in both those categories. 34% higher, so significantly higher chance of you being diagnosed with dementia if you're Indigenous than if you're a non-Indigenous person in this country. Now, with that as that context, and I think that's important because is that reflecting some biases that we're seeing and things going on, or is there something different in the diet, the DNA, that makes Indigenous people more susceptible to the things that biologically cause dementia? Those are all, important questions to ask. But let's go back again to oral societies. The Stalo Society, this is Elder Rosaline George that I had the pleasure of working with quite a lot in the 1990s. Because despite the popular and ongoing appeal of these interpretive models, right, these theories, we know that these ideas were, in fact, incorrect, ethnocentric, and harmful. They reinforce prejudice, they compromise people's ability to communicate across cultures and to be respectful of one another. And they lie at the very heart of the relationships, of the rationales, I should say, that justify the imposition of power and the colonization of one people over another. That's what these ideas are part of, that discourse, that they justify it. In fact, we know that orality and literacy are not opposites, and they are not sequentially arranged in relationship to one another. And the ideas that were earlier thought that a cognitive shift occurs in the brain when you become literate that you can never go back from, and then therefore you're better than anybody, that those are not the case. People now with scans and things can see that those people who are hypothesizing that were in fact racist, right, and things. But what we can say, though, is that in oral societies, memory was highly valued. Right? It had to be, because you didn't have that encyclopedia, you didn't have Google, you didn't have the newspaper bringing you news from distant places. So memory was really important. If you wanted to know what plants were edible, what plants were medicinal, where you could fish, what time the salmon spawn, when the berries are ripe on the mountains, you better remember what you heard from somebody else. So memory is really important in oral societies. Great training went into learning things. Memory training was important, so that people knew stories correctly, to ensure that rituals were done correctly. In the same way that medical procedures have to be done correctly, rituals in indigenous societies, spiritual activities and things are meant to be done in a certain order and to be done correctly. And of course, memory enables you to know your genealogy, right? Your genealogy. So for the Stalo, there are two major types of oral history. One is the Shwokwiyam, and Shwokwiyam are the stories of the distant past, of the creation and transformation of the world, right? So some of you might recognize, which mountain is that over on the right there? Mount Baker, yeah. So Mount Baker, and then this one here? Mount Cheom, yeah. So in the Stalo worldview, those aren't the names of those mountains, right? The Stalo worldview, it's Kamshin is the Mount Baker. That was a man, a prominent Nooksack Siam, an elder, respected man who had several wives, one of whom was a Stalo woman named Tlitlake. She went to live with him, had children with him, and then came home to visit her family. And when she was home, the transformer Chachels came through the Fraser Valley, making the world right and permanent, the form that we recognize today. And he transformed her, zap, like that. Actually, the word is chetam in Halkamel, chetam, suddenly transformed. Chetam transformed her into a mountain and gave her the obligation of constantly, forever, watching over the Stalo people and the returning salmon as they come back up the river. Behind her to the right, you can see her dog, the profile of her dog. That's her Coast Salish woolly dog that traveled with her. Cedar tree. The cedar tree was a man who was incredibly generous, always sharing, always giving, never taking anything for himself. And when the transformer saw him, he said, "Chitum," and turned him into the cedar tree. So the cedar tree would then give posts for making house posts, planks for the walls and the roofs, canoes for the dugout canoes, the bark, the inner bark for clothing, the roots for making baskets, the Y's at the end of the branches for doing spiritual cleansing, the slightly larger branches for making snowshoes, et cetera, et cetera. The cedar tree is always giving, always sharing. It's at the center of Coast Salish society because it was a generous man. So these are the Shwokwiyams. And in the Stalo Coast Salish tradition, when you tell a Shwokwiyam, you can't shorten it. To shorten it is to risk shortening the lives of the people in your audience. You can't change the story. You're obligated to tell it the way you heard it. To change the story is to risk causing deformations, changes in unborn babies in any pregnant women who are listening to the story. So unlike in our society where if I say a story wrong, right, to you, that might be plagiarizing, right? And I could get in trouble because of the harm that will come to me. In Stalo traditions, it's the harm that's potentially doing to you. So you, if I'm up here telling you a story, you're going to be pretty, hey, don't you change that story, because you don't want to have your life shortened, have your grandchild's be born with deformities and this sort of thing. So a real deep emphasis on keeping stories right, doing the references. I heard this story from so-and-so who told it this way because they heard it from so-and-so, and to do that right. The second type of oral traditions are called squelquel. Squelquel. Often they're translated by elders as, oh, this is the true news. And that's a way of sort of telling white people that, oh, these are the things that happen kind of around now that don't seem quite as miraculous that you'll probably believe when I tell you. Their personal histories. This is what I did when I was a child. Their family histories. Here's what my mom said she did as a child. Their community histories. Our community has always been wonderful at fishing. We've had a reputation of being great fishermen. In these ways, they link to your identity, who you are. They tell other people who you are. You're articulating that. They link you to your ancestors, right, which is really important, because once you can link yourself to ancestors through your genealogy, you're able to access food, and other types of resources on the land. Without that, you don't have the link. So if I'm a Stalo person living 200 years ago, if I want to go fishing, I can't just show up at somebody else's fishing site and fish. Those are fighting words, right? I can't go out and hunt up on a mountain in a meadow at a certain time of year when another family has claimed that as their space to hunt elk at that time of the year. And the same for medicinal plants, et cetera, et cetera. So these stories and knowing these stories, the memory is really important. And it's really important if you look at just the way their society is structured. So whereas in Western society at this time, 18th, 19th century, you have the pyramid with the royalty at top, the king, the queen, the barons, the dukes, the earls, and then below that are the business class, the people who own businesses. Below that are the professional class, the doctors, the teachers, the accountants. Then below that are the working class and the peasants, and they make up the vast majority of the population. In Stalo Coast Salish society, the vast majority of people, because these circles represent the percentage of populations who were in those classes, the vast majority are known as Smalath, which repeatedly in the 90s when I first got here, I'd ask elders, well, could you translate Smalath for me? And they would say, worthy people, worthy people. And I'd say, well, what does worthy mean? And they'd say, people who know their history. People who know their history. People who have a memory, who have accurate memories about the past. That makes you worthy and high status. People below that, a smaller percentage of the community, are St'ekum. What does that mean? Literally translates as worthless people. That's kind of a harsh term, right? Worthless people. And when I asked elders like Ed Nabob, Andy Commodore, Bill Pat Charlie, others in the early 90s, what that was, they all would share the same definition. Oh, these are people who don't know their history, or they lost their history, or they forgot their history in some way. So they couldn't access, they didn't know when they could hunt fish, where they could gather and plant. They didn't know how to do that. Then at the very bottom, there was a class of slaves, Squiath, in Stalo society at that time. Whoops. There we go. Now, some of the scholarship out there, quite a bit of it actually says, oh, Indigenous people don't have a word for dementia. They don't have a word in their language for dementia. Yes and no, I think. I'm not sure if that's accurate or not. What I can say is that the particular pathological definition of dementia and the associated cultural stigmas that Western society has ascribed to age dementia were not present, or at least not present in the same way or to the same degree in Coast Salish societies prior to colonization. So that is to say that they brought Indigenous people, and they still bring different meanings to things that we might describe and label as dementia. So here are a few Halkomelem words that relate to memory, that relate to knowing and forgetting and remembering, and also to being crazy, being insane, like that old European idea of what dementia is, right? So these terms exist, but you'll notice, though, none of them are specifically about old age, that they're not associated with that necessarily. And I think that's important. Now, if we're going to be talking about Indigenous people today and the elders that I've interviewed and other elders, and if you're a caregiver or you're working in that area, you want to give proper care and service in a way that is respectful and understood by those communities. A big context in all of this are the efforts that have gone into, from the Canadian government and society over the past 150 years, to take away people's ability to know their landscape, to know their history, to know their language. All those things that in the past were markers of high status, those things were targeted by residential schools, where you would take people away from their children, away from their parents and grandparents, so they weren't learning the language, they weren't participating in seasonal activities, they didn't know where they could go hunt or fish because they weren't participating in that process. And when they came home, if they couldn't speak the language or as fluently as their ancestor or their parents or grandparents, then they lacked the ability to access that knowledge. Now, ostensibly, the schools, the teachers, and everything, they would claim they were setting this up to open opportunities for Indigenous people. We're going to assimilate them so that they'll be able to participate in Canadian society, right? Be that as it may, or whatever their motivations were, there's no denying that this was taking people out of their culture and society. So if you look around here, 3 residential schools that were operating, 2 Catholic, 1 Methodist, and 1 Anglican, and then a series of day schools that pop up in the 19th or the 20th century that are still heavily controlled by the Catholic Church, although they're state-funded and the teachers were not necessarily clerics. And I put on the other side of this a bottle of Crown Royal. And I put that there because the Stalo people did not have alcohol or other mind-altering drugs prior to colonization. There's a recent dissertation that's looked at the history of tobacco and other substances. The spirit quests, the activities that Stalo elders would embark in, that Stalo elders would, or people would embark on to acquire knowledge, spirit knowledge, what knowledge from another dimension. That was done through fasting, through plunging into cold water, through sweats and other things. It wasn't alcohol induced. When alcohol was induced, and it was horrible, the alcohol that was introduced in the 1850s and 60s and 70s, it was by whiskey peddlers across the border. It was poisonous and it would cause death in certain cases, blindness in other cases. But what that did, or what people saw, the Stalo people, if you go back to that list I had here, right? Oh, that person is acting, they're drinking, they're acting in a crazy way. So there's an association then to something. There was some kind of behavior before contact that was recognized as being not normal in some way, and they associated that with alcohol, not with necessarily old age, but with alcohol. Now, in our society, we often talk about, sort of the body, the mind, the soul, and, holistic approaches to care, healthcare, and people's overall health. And I think that's important. I'm not saying this is trying to get away from this, but we have to think about Descartes, right? And this Cartesian dualism, the French philosopher Descartes, he had, in the Renaissance, brought forward the idea that one could embody both a spiritual and a secular identity, that these were two separate things, right? And he suggested that the body could be considered a machine entirely separate from the spiritual world. Descartes was rational, and he's also a stoicist, right? He was trying to move forward with this new philosophy. And I think, so that was this sort of division. And then what you see is a pushback by Christian healers, nuns who run hospitals, Mennonite, other, not, Christian, but not necessarily Catholic, Catholic and Protestant, who have said, no, that's too much of a division, and it leaves out the spirit in some way. It's about there's a mind and a body, but what we see is a mind, body, and a spirit that need to be sort of brought together in some kind of a wholeness. And that, in many ways, is tied to often what is seen as sort of pan-Indigenous, pan-Indian, pan-Indigenous traditions that talk about mind, body, spirit, and heart, right? The four pieces that go together. I'm not here to critique any of this. I'm just giving a sort of a sequential sort of history of how these have come about and how they relate to each other. But what I do know from my research, working with elders and reading ethnographic records, unpublished ethnographic records from an earlier time period when people interviewed elders and kept those records, is that the Stalo saw the world a little bit differently. It was neither the Cartesian view, nor was it that mind, body, spirit balanced world that is common today, and in fact, many Indigenous people do talk about it. Rather, the Stalo had a physical body, the man in the middle, there's your physical body, it's real. But around it were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different spirit entities that could be added to, enhanced, in various ways, but that had to be kept in balance. They had to be kept in balance. And if you notice, over here, this one. This was a spirit, that was a spirit, part of, one of your spirit parts of a person that was associated, often referred to as vitality by earlier elders who translated this in the 1920s and 30s. But it was associated with rational thinking, and with memory, rational thinking and memory. It wasn't their mind, it wasn't a separate idea of a mind, a brain and separate. It was one of 6 different spirit entities that people had. Other spirits did different things. Other ones you could have, some of them you could have only one of, but like Smumstiak, you just have one. But others you could add to. You could accumulate more spirit helpers that you could acquire out in nature. But the point was they all had to be kept in balance in some way. And to take away, if you didn't have one of these or it was compromised in some way, then you were going to be sick. You were out of balance. You would not behave properly. You would not behave in ways that were recognized by your community. You would go from being Huelmuk, people of life who we recognize, to Latsumuk, people who are different. And I don't understand what that is. Why are they behaving like that? After someone passes away, 2 parts of their spirit entities come together to become their spokwitha. The spokwitha is referred to sometimes as the ghost, the spirit that will stay at cemeteries or in the homes or the places that were frequented by people. That includes, though, right, the vitality, the memories that would go with that. And over on the top right-hand side, the idea of shwali, that's sort of the soul of a person. And the ancestors who were transformed into those rocks, mountains, trees that I talked about, they continue to have within them the shwali of those living ancestors within the Stalo epistemology. So when Stalo people, certainly in the late 19th and early 20th century, talked about memories, what are memories? How do we remember things? How do we keep things clear? They would talk about disputes. Old Pierre from Catesy, a Stalo elder from the Catesy First Nation in the 1930s, was recorded saying, after a big potlatch ceremony, there was a dispute between two families over who had the right to access and regulate a certain resource site on the ground. And so what they did is they asked people, old men, who he referred to as sort of like lawyers, who would come together to try to figure it out, pull their memories together. And if they couldn't do it, they could go out and find those memories on the landscape. You can get history from stones, from mountains, from animals, and from trees. It can be acquired because it's resting there in a way kind of like a library in Western society. So it could be a tree. It could be the stone. This is Chetum, the transformer stone over in Mission. And interestingly, I'll give an example of a story that related to my own research early on. Back in 1992, one of the first elders that I was meeting with on a project I was assigned by the Stalo, I was an employee at the time with the Stalo Nation, was to look into the history of traditional governance for the Stalo. I interviewed 27 different elders over the course of that project, and some people had little bits of knowledge, and putting it all together, you could get kind of a picture of things. But I was finding that if I went back into the ethnographic record to find elders who'd been interviewed in the past, well, they had more memories of that earlier types of governance, with the exception of one man, Wesley Sam, who had this incredible knowledge about past traditional governance. And so I'd go to see him, and at the time I lived in Victoria and I would commute over here for that first year. So I'd see him once a month, essentially. And he would sit back, close his eyes, cross his arms and say, okay, ready? So I'm ready, right? Got my notebook out. And then he would sort of give me a lecture. It would go on for maybe 15 or 20 minutes. And it was beautifully coherent, it was detailed. And then he would say, oh, okay, done now. And then we'd sit up and then have a cup of coffee. And then he'd say, yeah, come back and I'll share more with you later. And at the time I wondered, why doesn't he just share it all with me right now, right? I'd like to get this all right now. And I got to know Wesley over time, over months, coming back and forth. And then eventually I moved here so I could see him on a more regular basis, he and his wife. And I said to him, at one point, I asked the question, right, where did you get this information from? It's so detailed. And he goes, oh, my grandfather, Bob Joe, who was an elder in the Chilliwack community. I thought, oh, Bob Joe, of course, right? One of the most respected elders interviewed by an earlier generation of anthropologists, renowned for his knowledge, right? Of course, that's where you got it from. I didn't realize that was your grandfather. And I said, and so in my mind, I'm thinking of a little young boy sitting on his grandfather's knee, passing down the wisdom of the ages, right? Except that Wesley was an illegitimate child. And when he was 3 years old, he was taken by his mother because his grandfather, Bob Joe, would not allow him to stay in the family. High status family, and he had gotten pregnant by someone from a lower status, and there was some tension there. And so Bob Joe took Wesley and dropped him off at the Methodist residential school, and he was raised there. He didn't come home in the summers. He had no access to his grandfather's knowledge. And I was like, wow, okay, now what's he talking about? And that's when he said, well, but now he regrets having done that. And so now he's sharing with me in his dreams, in my dreams. He's bringing me this knowledge in my dreams. And so I find out when you're coming and the questions you're asking. And then when I dream, my grandfather gives me the information so I can then share it with you at these sessions. It's like, wow, holy cow, that's not how history works where I was trained in school, right? And yet, the information he was giving me was not only detailed, but it coincided with the information that I was finding in these much earlier records. It wasn't like he was making stuff up. It was accurate. And there was no other elder that I met who had that kind of accuracy, and yet he had no access in the way that I would normally think of a place to acquire those memories. Now, memory loss, age regression. These are things I like to talk about a little bit, right? Accurate time is critical in modern society, right? Where technology and fashion and pop culture change like this, right? You have to be at work at 9 and work ends at 4. And if you work past 4, that's overtime, time and a half, right? People keep track of time. Time is really important. And if you're wearing clothes from the 20s and you're a flapper, that looks great in the 20s. But by the 30s, oh my God, you're out of style, right? And that's bad, to be out of style. It's to be lower status, to be not as well informed, to be not well engaged, right? And disco was the thing, right, in 1977. But by 1980, disco is dead. Nobody wants disco anymore, right? Now, that's Western society. In Indigenous society, where things change at a much slower pace than that doesn't mean that they're static, unchanging cultures, but they change at a much slower pace than post-Enlightenment, post-industrial revolution Western society. And whereas Western society values and celebrates innovation, right, as a way of condemning old and obsolete things, right? I need the new iPhone, right? That iPhone from 2 years ago is just horrible. I can't bear to use it. I must have the new iPhone, right? Kids, you'll hear people say that, right? Indigenous societies, on the other hand, really value continuity. I'm doing this the way my grandfather did it, and I feel good about that inside. This is where my great-grandmother used to harvest cranberries, and I'm still harvesting cranberries here. I feel good about that inside. I'm wearing a blanket that has the crest of my family on the back. No one changes that crest. I'm proud that crest is unchanged, and it's my family's, and I can wear that. That's really different than in our Western society. And so this makes me think that perhaps having dementia and time shifting, right, as we talk about it with dementia patients often, may not have been as confusing or as stigmatized potentially among Indigenous people in certain cases. And so to make my point here, I hope I'm not running out of time yet. I still have a few things to say. I hope it's okay. I'm going to use examples from my own mother. And these are things I've seen also with some Indigenous elders, but I don't want to tell their stories I don't have their permission to tell those stories, but I'll share with you some of my mother's stories. So my mother, she experienced what clinical psychologists refer to as time shifting with her dementia, right? This is my mother 2014, this is my mother 2015, this is my mother in 2018 over here. So over here, she was still living at home with my father, but she didn't recognize me. She no longer knew that I was her son, right? But she knew how to wing it. She could meet people and put on a big smile and say, "Oh, hi, haven't seen you." I didn't know who you were, but she could do that. Then she went into a care home because at a certain point, my father had a heart attack and he couldn't take care of her at home. And at the time I lived in Saskatchewan, they were living here in BC. So my mom went into a care home. And my mother had been a school teacher when she was young. And she'd actually taught in rural schools at Port Hardy, Grand Prairie, Whitehorse, and Kamloops. And these schools were public schools. These schools were Catholic schools, but they were a mix of Indigenous and settler kids. And my mom grew up 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, right until she was 28 when she met my dad and got married. That was her life, going to these different small communities teaching. My mom had told me a lot about her time as a teacher, how much she loved it, how great it was and things. When she was going back through her time traveling, my mom thought that her teddy bears were her students, and she would line them up on her bed, and then she would start to teach them ABCs and numbers and colors, and she would do this repetitively over and over again. And it was quite lovely, quite charming, and she seemed happy. And then 6 months or so later, these stories became dark. Suddenly now that man's coming, he's gonna hurt the children. He's not gonna hurt the children. I won't let him hurt the children. Where's my father? Where's my father? He'll come, he'll take that man and he'll throw dirt on him. That's what she said, he'll throw dirt on him. I thought, wow. And this would just cycle through her mind over and over and over again all day, so that her whole day was just anxious, anxiety, and fear of this bad man who is coming to hurt the kids. This is a story she had never shared with me when she had clear mind. And so I was wondering, now is this something she just never spoke about in the past? Or is this, because we know people with dementia, even though they can recall older memories, they're less accurate about the old memories than are people without dementia. There's been clinical studies of that. So is my mom somehow creating memories that were dark and frightening like this? Or is she now having terrible things that she saw or witnessed or feared in the past come forward, and she no longer has the cognitive skills to keep them away or to place them in a context of something else? I don't know for sure. This is my mom, though.
Working.
Yeah, that's working?
He was working, no,
Oh, yeah.
these
Yeah.
work, put them in there.
Oh,
They're
sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, okay,
yeah.
okay.
And the boys, and they play out, and so they see they were from there.
Hooked it up like that. Oh, okay.
He's slowly settling around.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, yeah.
It's got to be we say love, because
Love, yeah.
it's her.
Yeah. I'm going to stop there. So if you couldn't understand what she was saying earlier, it was that word salad that is so common with elderly people with dementia. She would be talking like it was words, but they were gibberish words. But there might be one or two words that I could pick up, and I would try to then lean into it as if to say, oh, I understand what you're saying, and give her body language that would affirm that or things. But this is interesting because at this point now, this is just after she stopped having those terrible, terrible fears of someone coming to hurt the children. And now she would just kept talking about love, blah, 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 word salad, love, love, she would say. And you could just see this weight had been lifted off her shoulders. And for myself and my family, thank gosh, right? Because it was so weighted. My father spent time with my mother, and I see this again with Indigenous communities where the partner just devotes themselves to that. They don't want to put their loved one into a care home. That's somehow, I think, seen as reflecting on them that they're not a good person. They're not taking care of their family, their spouse, the way they should take care of them. And my father, until he had his heart attack and then cancer and passed away, he tried to keep my mom home, and then after that he would come down and feed her 3 times a day in the hospital. In fact, she put on 120 pounds because he overfed her, and the nurses were trying to stop him, and he snuck her chocolates and things, and it was terrible. And then my mom would regress even further, though. And at a certain point, she got to where she was about 5 or 6 years old in her mind. We had to take away all the mirrors because she thought she got scared of the old lady in the mirrors. But she thought she was 5 or 6, and she kept asking, where's my dad? Where's my mom? And so I had one of her old nursery rhyme books from when she was a girl, and I would read that to her, and then that would calm her down, and she would fall asleep. Now, people with dementia often live in the past, and they regress as the dementia progresses. Recent science reveals that this is because memory is not just one process in the brain, but a collection of different systems overlapping and interacting. Alzheimer's impairs short-term memory, but it can leave long-term memories a little more accurate, but they're still unreliable, and we're still not sure what those are. People with dementia judge the passage of time more quickly, both in terms of estimating how long it has taken to get from one point to one point. So if you take someone with dementia like my mother and you take her out on an outing in the car, you put her in the car, you drive around all over town, drive to all the places she knew when she was a little girl, and she's all excited, happy to see them. Then you bring her back to the care home. She's like, well, aren't we gonna go out and look at all those places? So in her mind, you was turned around in the parking lot and came back. It was time travel. Like that quickly, she was home. All the in-between parts were gone. And those diagnosed with dementia underestimate the time to do difficult or reoccurring tasks, creating a feeling of a relatively emptiness, right, that they have. Now, I want to situate this idea that a lot of people with dementia have, that they're time traveling, both because my mom traveled back in time and got younger, and I know a lot of elders that I've met, that was happening with them, but also because she would time travel. She would be instantly from one place to another because she forgot all the things in between. Like she could remember the anchors on each end, getting from leaving and getting back, but all the middle part was gone. And in the Stalo world, there are mystical tunnels that only certain people with certain knowledge and training are able to find and use and travel through time and space instantaneously. And I've mapped some of these out in my book, The Power of Place. It's part of the research I was doing at the time. But these arrows all indicate places where there is an invisible tunnel. You can't see it, But elders who are properly trained know where it is, and they know that it's dangerous, so they don't want you going there in case you get sucked into it, pulled into it. But what it does is the same thing that my mom could do in the car. You start there, and then suddenly you're there. All the time in the middle is gone. You don't recognize it. I'm not saying that this is a reflection of dementia in the past, or that it means that there were elders in canoes who were traveling and they remember leaving and then getting to the other side and have forgotten the middle part and therefore speak as if they had time traveled and people, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying there's some interesting parallels there. There's some interesting parallels there. Perpetual liminality and the concept of the self. I'm coming to the end here now. I think what happens when people struggle with this idea of the self, am I losing myself with dementia, right? Am I ceasing, is Grandpa no longer who Grandpa was? It's a question of, are we unbecoming who we were, it seems to me. Are we unbecoming? Or are we in the process of becoming who we were before? My mom became a young teacher and then an even younger little girl. She didn't recognize the physical woman in the mirror, but she had a clear sense of herself, and it was her old self in some ways. So she hadn't lost herself, but she had time traveled to a different self. Or is maybe that process, can we think of it differently, is it really the process of becoming who we could be? Is there something deeper and bright, shining light there where my mom, as that little, when she first sort of got back to the point where it was all about love, and she was in a comfort place? Is it when she was a little girl and you read those nursery rhymes and you talk about her father? I don't know if you saw on the back wall, I'd drawn pictures. She would tell me what her house looked like when she was little, and I would draw pictures of, I'm not a good artist, but I'd draw a picture of my grandfather sitting on a chair and her on bed, and then I'd say, oh, now does he get up and come see you? And then she would sort of relate these stories again. So maybe she wasn't losing herself. Maybe she was just finding herself in another way. But I encourage people to think about that term of liminality. Liminality is a process of becoming. It's a process of being on the staircase, but never on the second floor or the first floor. But you don't know, are they going up the stairs or down the stairs? They're just on the stairs, right? Anthropologists use the term liminality to refer to people in the middle of a ritual. So imagine a potlatch ceremony where you're getting a new name as a Stalo person, and that new name gives you the ability to regulate that family fishing site. Before the ceremony, you don't control that fishing site. After the ceremony, you're a respected leader who's been acknowledged by your community with that role. In the middle of that ceremony, who are you? You're becoming someone. Everybody knows you're becoming something, but they're not quite sure what that is yet. But you're still who you were. And I think the Stalo were much more comfortable with this sense of liminality, and because they don't have a sense that time progresses this way and change is important and the past is something to set aside and the future is the way to go, and they don't venerate youth and beauty over elders and wisdom, and they value lived experience and wisdom as opposed to information and technology, that their sense of who they are and what it means to get old and what it means to perhaps remember differently or forget differently is probably different than our own. So meaning, I think, does precede experience. This is my last slide. Canadians grow up fearing old age. Canadians grow up fearing dementia. Canadians stigmatize those with dementia. But the meaning we bring to changes in remembering and forgetting associated with old age are not universal experiences that scientists and clinicians can control and label. They are products of gender, class, culture, sexuality, and other things. And all of these are historically contingent and culturally grounded. Lahai, thank you very much. I think I might have time for a couple of quick questions, and I hope that was kind of what you had in mind, Shelley. Are there any questions? Yes.
I have a question, if I may. You talk about gringos, me, and First Nations and solo people. Is it possible to, for me to take on that interpretation that you shared, what they have? And, obviously we've expected, we expected them to interpret our experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a question for, thank you. That's a question for the Stalo community. I'm not Indigenous, I should say that up front, and this isn't a research project I've been working on. This is just me pulling together some things that have occurred to me as I've done other projects with the Stalo. So, and I haven't fully worked through all of this yet, so feedback and suggestions would be greatly appreciated. But I think there's a lot we can learn from Indigenous people today. We just have to be able to find ways of doing that which aren't simply appropriating and taking. The Stalo have a story. I'll end on this point maybe. The Stalo have a story, that story of Hatzik Ra Hatem, the Hatem stone over at Mission. And they say that that was three chiefs who, when the transformer came through, he turned to them and he gave them the power of literacy. He said, here's how you read and write. Share this with the nations. Share this with all the people. Then the transformer went on his way. But the three chiefs didn't share it. They hoarded that knowledge to themselves. And so when Carlson came back, he saw that and he was disappointed and he went, Hatem. And he turned them into stone. And that meant that by the time the Europeans arrived in this part of the world, the Europeans had literacy, but the Stalo didn't have literacy. And the literacy that the Europeans had, they were able to put things on paper that suddenly changed the lives of Stalo people. Indian Act, anti-potlatch law, fishing restrictions, hunting restrictions. And the Stalo didn't have that writing, that powerful writing that was shaping their lives. And they could write things that looked like maps, and they would say, on this map is a line, that's an Indian reserve, you have to stay inside that Indian reserve. Where did that come from? And in the story, the lady who told that story, the elder, she says, as she goes on from the elders who got turned to stone, she said there was a young girl who got raped by an American miner during the gold rush. And she got syphilis. She got a sores and a venereal disease on her genitals. And she gave that to her husband. And then her husband was shamed by this. He was shamed by this. And so he walked up onto the mountains and he lay down to die. He was just going to let himself starve and die. But a snake came forward. And the snake came up to him and bit the sores on his penis and ate the scabs and the sores. And then the snake, you could see it trembling and it got sick. And then it went over and it ate a certain plant and it got better. And that woman then the man looked over and he ate that plant and he got better and he brought the plant back down to his wife and family and they used that to get better. But the elder who told me the story says, but you see, because we didn't have reading and writing, we lost that knowledge. It was taken from us. And then the white doctors came and they took that knowledge and they wrote it down and now they use it and we don't have it anymore. And that's how it ended. So I think it would be beautiful if we could learn from people who have different ways of seeing the world, especially if that's going to help us live better lives. We just have to be careful we do it in a way that's respectful and on their terms. So thank you very much. I hope you have a great day.